proceedings from the October board meeting have been distributed. There are any comments, additions, deletions to those? I see no hands up. Any objections to approving those as submitted or approved by consensus? We have an agenda that got distributed. And are there any additions, deletions to the agenda? Emerson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have two quick items, or just announcements that I'd like to make at the end under new business.
You want to tell us what those are so that we know which items? What are the subject?
It's about one is an educational program for recreational fishermen to reduce discard mortality, and the other is a letter from Arnold Leo.
Okay. Thank you. Any other additions on the agenda? I'd like to have a brief, under other business, I'd like to have a brief discussion of the amendment, just to make sure that everyone's clear where we're going after this action. Any other items? If not, I'm going to take the items in the order that they appear in the agenda. As we normally do, we afford the public an opportunity to comment. We had two individuals who signed up to comment. Now, I want to be clear here that the comments that you offer have to be on items that are not on the agenda. In other words, this is items that are not on the agenda, because we're going to move through the agenda, and you'll have, hopefully, with the attendance we have, hopefully I'll be able to take some comments from the audience as the proceedings that go along. Okay, so I've got two comments. If you could come up to the mic at the corner there, Robert Newberry and Robert Brown. Those are the only two that submitted statements of interest in commenting. Captain Newberry, if you could, please limit your comments to approximately a minute.
That shouldn't be a problem, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, thank you. My name is Captain Robert Newberry. I'm chairman of Delmarva Fisheries Association. I'm not going to directly comment on issues that are on the agenda, but what I would like to do is thank the ASMSC for putting all the meetings forward that we had in Maryland to get to where we are today, and also to our Department of Natural Resources for the many meetings that we had, both with recreational, commercial, and the for-hire industry. I mean, we've taken some long steps. There's been many meetings that we've had over the past year, and it's been hard for all of us to come to certain agreements, but I think we finally have. And the one thing I kind of wanted to clear the air a little bit on, we have heard that the recreationals are still a little bit upset that they're not being heard, but every meeting, and it's probably over 15 meetings I've been to with the Department of Natural Resources in Maryland, our recreational people have been there. And I think the department, working with ASMSC, has done a fantastic job, and I just want to thank you for the time and the effort that ASMSC put into all the public comments, not only in Maryland, but up and down the coast. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brown.
Chair and members of this committee, Robert T. Brown, President of the Maryland Waterman Association. I'd also like to thank you for all the consideration that you've given all the people and all the different entities of the fishing industry. And we have had a very hard time, again, to make tough decisions. My main comment is I'm a commercial fisherman. I've been fishing. I started back in the 60s. And as of the last couple springs, and especially this spring, the number of large rockfish, I'm talking 46 to 50 some inches long, that we have been catching in my whole seine. I'm fishing primarily for gizzard shad, which is a bait fish that we send down to Louisiana for crawfish bait, which we are releasing. I've made a couple holes this spring, and this amount of these large fish, I probably had close to 2,500 pounds one day. I had to just drop the net and let it go. And I had 1,500 another day. I had to drop and let it go. And then we get up to, and this is up at the head of the places, not in the mainstream of the rivers, way up in the waters. Like they're probably only a third of a mile wide at the most. Some places they're not that wide. But I just want to make you aware of the number of large fish that we are catching. I have not seen since I was a teenager back in high school. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Anyone else in the audience? If not, we'll come back to the table. Bob Beal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick comment. Since we are able to start a little bit early, a couple of the states aren't here. I think Delaware's in transit. They're still trying to get here. PRFC, I don't think I see Marty down there. So, I think it's fine to go ahead and start, but we may need to give some deference to those folks or others that may be showing up for public comment. The understanding that we are starting 45 minutes early, and they may need to give them a little bit of ability to catch up once they get here, and they may have some follow-up questions. So I just want to put that on the record that we need to, make sure we get all those folks accommodated.
Given Bob's comment, it actually is a good segue into my next comment. In terms of the process that I'd like to follow, we basically have three major presentations you're going to hear today, and I'd like to go through all of those and allow the staff to fully flesh out the different items. And then once we finish that, then we'll go back and take questions on it. That'll allow additional time for some of these other states to come back to the table. Yep, Shuri.
This also might be a good time to have other business by Emerson brought up too.
All right, so I think what I'd like to do is to start with the presentations. As I said, you're going to hear three presentations today. One is on a summary by Max of the Addendum 6. Nicole Costa is going to provide the technical committee comments, and then we'll hear, I think, from Max again on the enforcement report, unless Kurt attends the meeting. So, Max, if you could run through the summary. There's a summary document in the material you've got that I think he's going to follow.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, we have a few presentations for you. This is an outline of all of it. I'm going to start with a very brief review of Addendum 6 and then move right into proposed measures for 2020. I'm going to transition to Nicole, who will walk through the technical committee report, and then bring it back to me for the law enforcement committee report. And then at that point, I believe we'll open up for questions. So quickly, just a reminder, the board approved Addendum 6 back in October of 2019. The addendum aims to address overfishing and to reduce F to the target in 2020. Based on projections, it calls for an 18% reduction in total removals. So for the commercial sector, all state quotas are reduced by 18%. In the ocean, the recreational fishery is constrained by a one fish at 28 to 35 inch slot. In Chesapeake Bay, the recreational fishery is constrained to one fish at 18 inch minimum size. And of course, states can submit for conservation equivalency, CE, to implement different measures. Those proposals must demonstrate at least an 18% reduction at the state level. So recreational and commercial removals combined must equate to an 18% reduction. Lastly, the addendum implements a circle hook requirement for the recreational sector when fishing with bait to address dead releases. As far as our timeline, states were required to submit implementation plans and CE proposals at the end of November of last year. It took a few meetings for the TC to fully vet those proposals. There was an in-person workshop in December, and then we had a conference call in January Also in January, the LEC reviewed CE proposals to provide comment on enforceability. So today the board will review and consider approving those proposals, and then states are required to implement regulations by April 1st of 2020. However, the circle hook provisions, that has a separate timeline for January 1 of 2021. So next I was going to walk through all the proposed measures for 2020. I'm essentially looking at the tables that were included in the TC memo, which was provided in supplemental materials. That's an updated table from what was included in briefing materials, so I just want to make note of that. If you want to follow along, that might be helpful. There are a lot of options on the table, so I wanted to take a minute and just sort of summarize the proposals. First, there were, most states did submit CE, and some of those states' proposals included several different options. So the first takeaway is that there is potential for coastwide, or at least some regional consistency, but there's also potential for disparate measures, different regulations in the ocean and in Chesapeake Bay. Regarding the measures themselves, they primarily include combinations of bag limits, size limits, and season closures. A few of the options include a unique no targeting provision, closed season, and also putting in a requirement that anglers cannot target striped bass. And then there's a few sector-specific or mode-specific measures as well. Of note, only proposed measures that were accepted by the TC based on technical merit are provided in those tables. Some states did include other options that didn't make it through the TC vetting process, and so they're not included in those tables. And that also, I just wanted to make a point that the combination of proposed commercial and recreational options by state also meet that required 18% reduction. So I have them parsed out by rec and commercial, but it should be known that as a state implementation plan, those all collectively meet the reduction required in each state implementation plan. And then lastly, the circle hook component does not count towards any of these calculated reductions. It is merely a conservation benefit of the addendum. There's no credit given towards these measures with the circle hooks. Okay, so I'm going to start with the recreational measures. So again, just following through those tables in the TC memo, I tried to use the same numbering as what the states used in their implementation plans to hopefully make for easy cross-referencing. I did have to remove the column labeled other to get all this to fit clearly on the slide. And also I want to highlight that the predicted reduction column, there's a calculated percent reduction there for all the CE options. If a state is proposing the Addendum 6 measure, there was no calculation needed. And I'm going to try to move through these pretty quickly. Just going to hit the highlights, and we can always circle back for questions once we get through all the presentations. So for Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts, pretty straightforward. They're all proposing the Addendum 6 measure, one fish, 28-inch to 35-inch slot limit. Rhode Island is proposing 3 options, first being the Addendum 6 measure. The second is a 32 to 40-inch slot limit for all modes. And the third option, option C, is 2 separate slot options, a 32 to 40-inch for the private and shore modes, and a 30 to 40-inch slot for the for-hire sector. So that's what those acronyms stand for. You'll see that repeated in some of these slides. Rhode Island, Connecticut, also in tandem with New York, have submitted a regional proposal. I'll get into that in a few slides as well. These are the options submitted for New York in its ocean fishery. There's a suite of options here. The first series is slot limits, including the Addendum 6 measure, and then a number of others with a 28, 30, and 32-inch minimums. Option 7 is actually a combined slot and trophy fish option. Options 8 and 9 are minimum sizes. And then option 10 is specific to the for-hire sector. It's essentially any of option 1 through 9 plus a 31-inch minimum for the for-hire sector. The seasons here, they're mostly this May 1 through November season, but option 5 and 9 would keep the current longer season, mid-April to mid-December, and then options 1 and 3 are also being considered under both seasons. Oh, yeah, so I wanted to highlight that all these calculated reductions on the left-hand side there, those do account for removals from the Hudson River and the Delaware River. So next I'm going to show you the Hudson River and Delaware River options for New York, and you can see the percent reduction on their own is less than 18%, but when you combine any of these options with any of the options on the previous table, it does meet that 18% reduction. So these are smaller slot sizes for Hudson River. The main difference is the season, and then the second option there is a combined slot and trophy option. And then for the Delaware River portion in New York, that is proposed to have the Addendum 6 measure. Here's the regional proposal for Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New York. Of course, the intent here is to have regulatory consistency, primarily for Long Island Sound and around Block Island, is my understanding. So the idea here is if the states pursued one of these options, all states would implement that measure. And again, these predicted reductions account for Hudson River and Delaware River removals in New York. So those specific regional options would still be on the table for New York. Very similar to Rhode Island's, actually, there's two options. One includes the Addendum 6 measure, a 30 to 40 inch slot for all modes, and then a split option, 30 to 40 inch slot for the private and shore mode, and a 28 to 37 inch slot for the for-hire sector. Moving to New Jersey and Pennsylvania. So first with Jersey, again, also submitting a suite of options here. The first two I'll focus on. Those two were developed a little differently than what was put forward in the TC criteria, although the methods were approved or accepted by the TC. These are smaller slot options, which were developed through a spawner per recruit analysis. And because of those methods, it actually changes the percent reduction that those measures need to achieve. To do that, some additional closures are being proposed to see those reductions through. And then the other four options, R3 through R6, followed the TC criteria. I will note that R6 here up on the slide is provided for board consideration, but it was not submitted in time for technical committee review. We included here with the caveat that it did follow the same methods as option R5, which was vetted by the TC and accepted based on technical merit. So same methods there, but the TC didn't have an opportunity to comment on that option specifically. For Pennsylvania, proposing to implement the Addendum 6 measure year-round, and then for a two-month period, there would be a smaller slot limit, 21 to 24 inches, that achieves a 19% reduction there. So Delaware actually submitted two separate proposals. The first one here, the rec option 1, actually is combined with commercial option 1. It's an 18% reduction to both sectors. So here for the rec side, that equates to a 28-inch to 38-inch slot limit. And then the second option is a smaller reduction to the commercial sector and a 20% reduction to the rec side to take up that remaining balance. That actually results in the Addendum 6 measure, 28 to 35 inch. Under both of these, Delaware's proposing to implement the 20 to 25-inch slot during July and August for Delaware Bay, River, and trips. Those removals are accounted for in the options 1 and 2. For Maryland and the ocean, proposing the Addendum 6 measure. And these are all the options being considered for Maryland's recreational Chesapeake Bay fishery. There are 4 options here. All of them include a spring trophy season, 35-inch minimum from May 1 to May 15. And then the summer-fall fishery is a 2 fish at 19-inch minimum, essentially status quo is my understanding, where only 1 fish can be greater than 28 inches. And then in order to achieve the required reductions, the options propose season closures from January to April, also reducing the bag limit to 1 fish at 19 inches during August. That applies to options A through C. Also, no harvest for charter captains and crew, and there's an additional no targeting provision to meet those required reductions during parts of the winter and summer closures, depending on which option you're looking at. The 4th option in this table is a little different. It's a mode-specific option where there would be 1 fish, 19 inches for the private and shore modes, and a 2 fish at 19-inch minimum with that 1 fish over 28 inches for the for-hire sector. Moving on to DC and PRFC. DC is implementing the Addendum 6 measure for Chesapeake Bay, 1 fish at 18 inches. For PRFC, it's some similarities with Maryland's proposal. You have the spring trophy option, 35-inch minimum from May 1 to May 15th, and then the summer-fall season options are all a 2 fish at 20-inch minimum with varying season lengths. And the option 1 here for PRFC does also have that no targeting provision during the July and August closure. And Virginia's proposal essentially demonstrated what % reduction they would achieve under their status quo measures. That results in a 23.4% reduction, and so the commercial part of their proposal makes up the balance there. So these options are what's implemented right now for Virginia. The ocean 28 to 36, and the bay is 20 to 36 inches. North Carolina is proposing to implement the Addendum 6 measure. So jumping now to the commercial sector, remember that Maine, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and DC don't have commercial fisheries here, nor do they allocate any quota to the recreational sector. New Jersey, similarly, no commercial fishery. However, the proposal does include reallocation of quota to a recreational bonus program. In years past, Connecticut fell under this category as well, but the state has decided to discontinue its bonus program going forward. So for Massachusetts, there are a number of different quota options. They are all based on an 18% reduction in quota. The difference in pounds is based on the size limit that is chosen, and they all apply to the hook and line fishery. For Rhode Island, it's an 18% reduction as well, and you can see how that breaks out based on their measures for the different gear types. Similar to Massachusetts, New York is also proposing a few different quota options. They're all tied to an 18% reduction in quota. The poundage varies depending on the size of fish that is selected. here. So this is the bonus program for New Jersey. Again, no commercial fishery, but proposing to reallocate that quota to a recreational bonus program. Note here that the reductions in that proposal are achieved entirely through the primary recreational fishery measures. Here, the quota is not reduced. All those reductions are calculated through the primary rec measure. So the quotas vary by option based on the size limit that is selected. We do have some unique trade-offs here for options C1 and C2. Depending on which rec option is chosen in combination with that, you have a different quota tied to it, particularly for R6 from the previous table. That was the 33-inch minimum. That would be associated with an 18% reduction in quota, so that's in the parentheses under C1 and C2. And then options C4 through C7 are essentially the same thing. It's just varying levels of trophy permits that would be issued for those options. And keep in mind that this program behaves sort of the same way as the commercial fisheries do. There's a limited number of permits issued to ensure the quota is not exceeded. So for Delaware, again, as I was mentioning, Delaware option 1 here is tied to option 1 for their rec proposal. So it's an 18% reduction in quota. And then option 2 is a 1.8% reduction in quota. And you can see how it all plays out with the different gear types. For Maryland in the ocean, proposing a 1.8% reduction. Virginia, again, this was based on whatever additional reductions needed to be calculated based on the rec measures that are in place. It's a 9.8% reduction for the ocean fishery. And then North Carolina is proposing an 18% reduction for their fishery. For Chesapeake Bay, Maryland and PRFC proposing a 1.8% reduction there. And you can see how the quota shakes out amongst the gear types as well. And then for Virginia's Chesapeake Bay quota, it's a 7.7% reduction. And then my one slide here on the circle hook provisions. Again, this is a requirement for recreationally fishing for striped bass with bait. The timeline for implementation is different than the other requirements. It's January 1, 2021. Now, because of that, there really wasn't much information provided in the implementation plans for a thorough vetting. States generally explain the various scoping processes that they would pursue, the types of education programs that they would try to create, the different outreach materials that they would be putting together, how to get the word out. But as far as concrete draft regulatory language, that was really not enough time for them to put that together. Because of that, the TC is actually requesting that states resubmit implementation plans for the circle hook provisions later in 2020. I have a proposed date up there, August. I think it would be helpful for the board to specify a submission deadline by the end of this meeting. I propose August merely because we could have this brought back to the board in October for final consideration at the annual meeting. Of course, I leave it up to you guys to decide if that's an appropriate timeline or not. Okay, so we're going to immediately shift into the technical committee report, just a few slides there, and then a few slides for the LEC.
Thanks, Max. I'm going to give the technical review of state implementation plans and conservation equivalency proposals. And as Max just went through all the state-specific options, these are going to be more general caveats, assumptions that the TC discussed, as well as a few specific comments that the TC had on proposals. So in general, there's a high level of uncertainty in the percent reductions calculated due to changes in angler behavior or effort, size, structure, and distribution of the population, and these changes are difficult to account for and cannot be accurately quantified. There's greater certainty in the percent reductions for simple measures, such as bag and size limits, relative to more complex measures, including slot limits, trophy fish options, and sector-specific regulations. The predicted 18% coastwide reduction may be different after accounting for CE measures. The expected percent reduction with CE proposals cannot be evaluated until all jurisdictions implement 2020 management measures, and this is due to the fact that states submitted so many different CE options. We would have to know what their final option was before we could evaluate what the coastwide projected reduction would be. There, as Max pointed out earlier, there's potential for no recreational regulatory consistency along the coast or within Chesapeake Bay with conservation equivalency. Enforcement of the proposed regulations needs to be considered, in particular, the interpretation of the slot limit and the potential to have differing regulations in neighboring states and within Chesapeake Bay. Most states have yet to develop circle hook regulations, as just discussed, and so states should resubmit their plans prior to 2021 for circle hook provisions to be evaluated. The TC supports closed seasons to reduce effort and discard mortality. However, predicted savings are highly uncertain due to current data limitations, and determining a reasonable assumption to predict expected savings under a no targeting provision remains a challenge. With closed seasons and a no targeting provision, the question becomes what will happen to all the trips where striped bass were previously caught and released. The assumption that all of these trips will cease to exist and therefore all of those fish will be saved is most likely unrealistic. However, it is also unrealistic to assume all of the releases will still occur. Reality is somewhere in the middle, and the TC was challenged in providing guidance on this assumption, as we cannot predict angler behavior and effort. There was also some question regarding the implementation of these no targeting provisions with the closed seasons. I believe the target implementation date is April 1, and some of these no targeting provisions may need more time to go through the regulatory process, and so if they're not implemented in time, we may not actually see the savings from these measures in 2020. The TC supports the use of SPR-based calculations in conservation equivalency proposals and has accepted proposals using this methodology. However, it should be noted that although technically sound, several of these proposals result in commercial quota increases relative to a state's Addendum 6 quota. The board has previously seen proposals where states are taking quota reductions through SPR analysis to have a reduced minimum size, and here we're seeing the opposite. We're increasing the minimum size through SPR. They're actually getting a quota increase. So although technically sound, we just wanted to point that out to the board. And that's all I have.
Okay, just a couple more slides here. So I'll be giving the LEC report on behalf of Kurt, who is the striped bass representative from the LEC. They met in January to comment on the enforceability of the CE proposals for striped bass and bluefish. There was a memo provided in supplemental materials, and I've pulled a few notable comments from that memo that are particularly for striped bass, and I'll go through a couple of those. So the first is that simple measures are preferred to ensure greatest compliance and enforceability. This was, the LEC sort of continued that, slot limits are certainly enforceable, but it could lead to unintentional violations, non-compliance that may increase in regions that have not previously been managed through a slot limit. So that transition, sort of an educational component there, you may see some unintentional violations. The second comment is about sector-specific measures that can create enforcement and compliance challenges. A particular comment came about for enforcement officers that are onshore and trying to discern whether a boat offshore is private or for hire, that can be very difficult. Also creates unintended challenges where these two groups of anglers commingle at docks, at marinas, areas like that. The third comment here is that different regulations between neighboring states and in adjoining waters present special enforcement challenges. They can often be very confusing to anglers. The LEC continued that it's not so much an enforcement issue, but it is a compliance issue often. Officers tend to just enforce strict possession, so wherever that angler is intercepted, those are the measures that they are held to. But inconsistent regs tend to create confusion. They can lead to other unintentional violations, increased noncompliance, anglers moving to different locales for better or more ideal regulatory conditions, things like that. Another comment about the no targeting provision. Essentially, the LEC stated that unless there is a very clear definition for not targeting striped bass, that this provision is essentially impossible to enforce. And they continued that it may be particularly difficult to define no targeting for a specific species when anglers use the same or very similar methods to target different species. And then the last comment here is, with that in mind, officers may not prioritize enforcement of certain regulations if they know it is not enforceable and cannot stand in court. That wraps up our presentation. So thank you, Mr. Chair. We're happy to take any questions on any of that material.
All right, thank you very much, all. What I would like to do is to start with questions, and we'll just work through the same reports in the same order. So questions for Max on his presentation. Any questions? Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually have a clarifying, I would like to clarify a couple of numbers that were in Max's report regarding the table for Maryland's Chesapeake Bay, if that's okay, to put that on the record.
Yep.
Some discrepancies between, so if we can make, Max, I don't know if you can bring up the Chesapeake Bay recreational table.
While he's doing this, let me encourage everybody, this is a time for questions and clarifications, just the way Mike is proposing it. Keep your comments to yourself until we get to the comment portion. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, so just a couple quick things. I just want to make sure that's clear for the record. I noticed that the other states all put in the provision in their implementation plans and their conservation equivalency proposals that would include the option available to the state through amendments, Addendum 6. We did not include that in our table, but I would like to just make the point that the Addendum 6 option for the recreational fishery in Chesapeake Bay, which is a one fish at 18-inch minimum size limit, is certainly one that we are considering. It's on the table for discussion, and we plan to bring that before our stakeholders and our public while we go through the regulatory process for making those changes. Secondly, I would like to point out that the table that you have on the screen right now is Maryland's first submission. The technical committee went through a number of revisions throughout the process of finalizing these tables, and so there are just some very slight differences there's one difference in the open season for option 4. The August 16th date should be August 15th, which is an extra day for the closure period during August. And under option 2 and under option, 2B and 2D, the percent reduction as calculated based on the modifications that our staff made based on TC comments equates to a 20.8% reduction rather than a 20.6 and a 20.7. That's all, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Other questions? Dan?
Yes, thank you, David.
Then John?
I had a question for Nicole. In your presentation, you mentioned that there was a problem with how states interpret a slot limit. What was meant by that?
I wouldn't say it was a problem. It's just, I think there might be a misperception that the 28 to less than 35 was inclusive of 35, and that goes for most of the slot options. I think there may be some confusion that that upper bound is not actually included, and so being clear about that to stakeholders is something that is going to require some education and outreach.
I have John.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Max, as you showed, there's different percent reductions for each conservation equivalency measure in the chart. Do we have an estimated percent reduction from high to low, worst case scenario and best case scenario of what those reductions might add up to on a coastal level?
No, we didn't do that calculation. As Nicole pointed out, we kind of looked and said there's a whole mess of options out here, and we didn't do the work to figure out what the lower and upper bound would be.
John, follow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we really won't know until after the states have their final measures in place. I think I understand that part of it, but I would just ask you, maybe give me an answer, or maybe you can't. There's a pretty good chance, or there at least is a chance, that it'll add up to significantly less than the 18% requirement, correct?
There are scenarios that are less than and above that 18%.
John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry for being late. I didn't realize we were starting 45 minutes early. I just had a question for the part I came in on for Nicole about the statement that for the commercial fisheries where they used SPR, that it actually was increasing their quota. Now, the quota is based on the landings in pounds. How does this get increased?
So in doing a spawning potential analysis, it's basically saying that by increasing your minimum size, you can increase your level of removals taken from the fishery and maintain the same spawning potential. And so we've seen it, you missed that part of the presentation, but we've seen it previously with proposals where you're decreasing your minimum size, you take a quota reduction. And on the converse now, we are seeing where you increase your minimum size, you can take a slight quota increase. And it's all about maintaining that same spawning potential under the two different minimum sizes.
John, follow.
Yeah, if I could just follow up. I mean, for most states, we're having to monitor our quota in real time. So certain states that are doing this are actually, we're kind of guesstimating what they're actually going to be landing commercially. And once again, I'm sorry for being here late, but this is, from a state that we had our summer slot fishery dinged, even though we pointed out that our fish were being double counted. And now we are double counting those fish, and then to see that other commercial fisheries are going to be allowed to proceed with really a quota increase and low accountability is not good.
Emerson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question was very similar to the question that John McMurray raised. So the technical committee then really has no guidance for us as to whether or not these measures, when put in place, any of the long list of options that we have here, when they're put in place, there's no guidance. We have no idea what we're going to get coastwide relative to the 18% reduction. That's what I'm hearing. That's part one. So just please verify that. And then the second part of that question is, so then how are we to proceed?
I'll take a stab at that. So, the states submitted a number of proposals, and it's the technical committee's responsibility to review the technical merit of those options. Does the methods check out? Does the data check out? It just so happens that there are a lot on the table, and it would have been a big lift to calculate what the percent reduction would be under all the different combinations of measures. So you didn't TC didn't have the time or effort to do that. As far as, it really goes back to the board as a policy decision on how they want to handle all these options that are on the table.
I've got Richie White.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To follow up on Emerson's, would it not be the case then that the one set of regulations that we do have in front of us that would guarantee that kind of mortality, lowering the mortality, is the 28 to 35? So that the technical committee would agree brings us to where we're supposed to be. Is that correct?
Yeah, given the uncertainties in the analysis, I mean, they were developed to achieve that reduction on a coastwide scale or regional scale, right? We have different measure for the bay, but yeah.
All right, I have Ray Kane and then Pat Kelleher.
Thank you, Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question, Nicole. On slide 2, the way I'm reading your slide 2 is the technical committee doesn't really feel good about having all these CE proposals put forth. They're not confident. They cannot make a confident decision on what will and will not work to achieve 18% reduction. I would suggest that the states that have submitted a conundrum of CE proposals, they come back with one proposal that the technical committee can look at and say, yes, we will achieve 18% reduction, as opposed to, I mean, this is a conundrum. It's a conundrum for the technical committee, which I respect. I think they've got a lot of good minds on it. And yet we, as a voting body, have to do something with this today. And we're hearing from our own technical committee that we're not sure. We're not sure if we're going to achieve 18% reduction. So I don't know how we go about that, Mr. Chairman, but these states have to come forward with a CE that will be approved by the technical committee that we can vote on. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. Excuse me. I've got Joe Cimino and then Marty.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it's important to remind the board that we never saw the state-by-state reductions from this coastwide measure that we're speaking about. And that's kind of unfortunate. You know, none of the New England states would achieve an 18% reduction under this coastwide measure. Only one state in New England even gets above 10%. I think the conservation equivalency options that are up here actually put many of the states at a higher target instead of, you know, depending on what is on paper a 43% reduction for New Jersey's fishery under the one coastwide measure that was voted on.
Thank you, Joe. I'm going to correct what I said before. I've got Pat Kelleher, Marty, and then Churi. Pat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try not to go into a comment about conservation equivalencies because I have been a supporter over the years. But seeing more than 50 of them in a document is concerning. But the technical committee memo in particular, I think it says a lot, and there's some things that it doesn't say that give me some concern as well. So I'm just wondering if Max or Nicole could expand on what impacts to the stock assessment could there be as a result of varying measures between the states.
Nicole?
So as previously discussed, I think the big concern we're hearing around the table is the 18% reduction. It was projected by the technical committee that we needed an 18% reduction in 2020 to bring F back down below the target in 2020 to address the overfishing status. With all of these conservation equivalencies on the table, all the uncertainties, all the caveats and assumptions being made, and because, as previously pointed out by Commissioner Cimino, we did not see the specific reductions that the coastwide measure would meet for each individual state. Some states were going to be taking larger than 18% if implemented the coastwide measure, and some states would be taking less than 18%. Now we're kind of all over the board with conservation equivalency proposals with everyone just having to meet the 18%. Some who were previously going to achieve, less than 18% with the coastwide measure are now just meeting 18%, and so they're actually increasing their reduction. But on the flip side, we also have some that were projected to exceed the 18% under the coastwide measure, and now with conservation equivalency are just meeting 18%. It's very uncertain. Calculating the reductions that we would achieve with all the different measures, as Max pointed out, was a big undertaking that the TC was already hard pressed for time in just reviewing all these proposals and getting comments together. And so as far as the impact on the stock and the stock assessment, it's going to impact our ability to reduce F back down to the target in 2020 if we can't meet that 18%. And so it's just addressing the overfishing status. The overfished is something that the board had planned to take up with the amendment later on in the year. So it merely just impacts our ability to reduce F back down to the target and address overfishing. If we don't meet the 18%, we might not bring F back down to the target.
Pat, you want to follow up?
So this is directed at Max with that better fleshing out of the uncertainty around this question. The current addendum, I don't believe, allows for any, if these fail, it has changed, the language has changed from one document to this most recent. So I don't believe that we would even have the ability to allow for payback as I'm reading the changes now. So I think we have to, unless you can correct me, I think we're going to have to tread very cautiously to ensure that what we do put on the table succeeds.
Thanks, Pat. Next one on the list, Marty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The question would be for Max relative to the Law Enforcement Committee and possibly Nicole to add her thoughts related to TC comments on targeting. PRFC has conservation equivalency proposals that were approved by the TC that include both targeting provisions and non-targeting. And assuming board approval, those will have a deliberation with our commission to decide one way or the other. And what I heard was from the Law Enforcement Committee, pretty strong wording, impossible to enforce, and then from the TC, uncertainty. And so that's the same feedback we have received from our law enforcement officers. But also we've had discussions at our commission about analogous to speed limits. You state a regulation of law, you put it out, you expect people to abide by it. And so I'm just wondering if you can provide any clarity to those discussions, Max, of the Law Enforcement Committee on how much of a problem that really is in terms of enforcing that. They're saying impossible. What are the ramifications for that? And how does that feed, Nicole, perhaps into that uncertainty component that you mentioned? So anything you can provide, I'm looking to potentially take back to our commission for our decision-making process. Thank you.
That's a good question, Marty. And I will say that unfortunately, there weren't any law enforcement officers from the Bay Area on that call. But the comment was that if you can't define no targeting striped bass, using specific gear types, terminal tackle, certain baits, if you can't define what that is, then in the eyes of the court, it's impossible to enforce.
I'm going to take one speaker out of turn here. Mike's got his hand up, and since there's a lot of discussion that relates to his state, if you want to offer a comment to answer the question, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So to Marty's point, and to Max's clarification that there wasn't anybody from Maryland on the Law Enforcement Committee, I did want to provide some comment to Marty's point that might help Marty. So in Maryland, we do have a definition for targeting. That definition reads that a person may not catch, harass, harm, pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, or attempt to catch striped bass in certain spawning rivers in certain areas of the Chesapeake Bay during certain times of the year. That rule has been on our books for a long time. Tickets are written and they are prosecuted in court. So while the Law Enforcement Committee has made the point that they are literally unenforceable, I would have to argue that depending on the definition that you have in your state and the intent of the officers to find people targeting striped bass, they are prosecuted in Maryland. And so I would have to oppose the point from the Law Enforcement Committee that it's unenforceable, because in our state it is. Thank you. And that hopefully will help Marty in his discussions with folks in the Potomac River. Thanks.
All right, I've got, Nicole wanted to follow up on Marty's point, and then I'm going to go back to the list. So I've got Sheree, Justin, and then Dan, and I've got 4 or 5 other people after that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to address the second part of that previous question, how the Law Enforcement Committee's comments tie into the uncertainty raised by the TC in achieving the 18%. We discussed this briefly, and I would say that for proposals that are relying heavily on those no targeting provisions in order to achieve their 18% or 20%, whatever reduction they've calculated is necessary under Addendum 6, if you're relying largely on these provisions, then we could have greater uncertainty there. If you're relying less on those uncertainties and relying more on other measures such as bags and size limits, there might be less uncertainty, but it's difficult to quantify.
I've got Sheree.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to defer my position on the list so that Tony can answer a question in regards to Pat, and then I'll pick it up.
Tony, you've been volunteered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to note Pat had brought up accountability in a sense, and he had used the word paybacks. I'm not going to use the word payback, but I think the board does have the opportunity to hold states accountable to what is in their plans by stating as they approve these or don't approve conservation equivalency that there is accountability, and you would just need to define what that accountability means. It could be to the percentage or harvest numbers that are in the state's conservation equivalency proposals. It can be dependent on whether or not you meet the coastwide reduction or don't meet the coastwide reduction that's required. So it is within your ability to do that today.
Just wanted to add that our FMP review process, whenever there's a new measure in place, we review that after a full year of implementation. We bring it back to the board, and they see that in our annual FMP review. And there is opportunity there as well to enforce any accountability the board has stated.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is a question and answer period, not comment period. So along the thread that there's been this discussion about OLE's concerns on aspects of enforcement, when the assessment is conducted, is there some efforts to move law enforcement uncertainty into these percentage reductions? I'm also looking at one of the general comments from OLE indicating that officers issue more warnings and citations following a change in regulations. So that first year, I would think you might never achieve an 18% reduction if you consider that aspect of things. Does the TC consider that at all?
So the TC does not consider, so what the TC can provide the board, there's an element of risk to it. So we can't really quantify what the likely non-compliance will be. We did, when we calculated these plans, these do include sort of an assumption of non-compliance, that we're assuming that there is going to be a certain amount of people who are not going to comply with these regulations, and that sort of the same people who didn't comply last year with those old regulations are still not somehow going to magically fall back in line. So there is an assumption that non-compliance will happen
happen, and that calculation is included in these reductions. So when you come down to that 18%, that does include some allowance for non-compliant harvest within the calculations. Obviously, we can't predict what the non-compliance is going to be like. In some cases, you would expect it to actually be better in a year where regulation changes because there is more of an effort to explain these new regulations. There's more outreach and people might know about it more. On the other hand, there's also things, if you've been fishing the same way for years, you may not be fully on board with that and become non-compliant accidentally. So what is that percentage? I don't think we've ever looked at the difference between a year with a regulation change versus a non-regulation change. But the recent average of non-compliance is included in these calculations. So we have the regs are sort of a little bit more conservative than they would be if you assumed that everybody just magically fell in line with the new regulations. I think there's also room, if the board wanted to pursue this in the future, to direct the technical committee to be more conservative when you're setting the percent reduction that you need. So right now, we said this is the amount of harvest that will have a 50% chance of achieving the F target next year. If you want to account for potential uncertainty in that actual compliance, then maybe you need a slightly higher reduction, that you have a higher probability of achieving the F target to allow you some slippage in those calculations. But a non-compliance estimate is included in these reductions. Is that enough? It's unclear. We'll have to see. Again, that relates back to angler behavior and trying to predict that in the next year.
All right, follow-up, Cherry?
Yes, thank you for that clarification. The second sentence, the question I had was, have we ever looked at state-specific reductions before on a historic basis, or have we always just looked at the coastwide percentage reductions?
Yeah, for striped bass, the last two have definitely been on the coastwide, that we present a set of measures that are achieves that reduction on the coastwide, and the board has considered that. To my knowledge, we have never gone state by state. We certainly have for other species, but for striped bass, it's always been a single coastwide measure.
Thank you.
All right, I have Justin and Dan, and then Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this is a question for Nicole and Dr. Drew. In the technical committee memo to the board, the technical committee stressed that predicted savings from a no targeting provision are highly uncertain due to current data limitations. So I'm wondering if you can expand on that a little bit, of what are the data limitations, what are the inherent uncertainties there? And I'm also curious whether those present just an issue on the front end of sort of assessing what kind of reduction you'll get out of a potential measure, or whether it might also apply to the assessing whether the measure achieved what it was supposed to, given that I can imagine if you enact a regulation saying that it's illegal to target striped bass, anglers being intercepted by MRIP might have a disincentive to report that they caught striped bass because they weren't supposed to be targeting them. So I'm wondering, MRIP data and the discard estimates that come from MRIP would presumably be the way you'd, find out if that measure achieved what it was supposed to. I'm wondering if it creates issues there with assessment.
So as far as the TC's thoughts on this, I would say the data limitations are, we're trying to predict angler behavior and effort, which is something that we cannot do. If, for example, we had a state who implemented a no targeting provision for a year, we could then look back between the previous year and the year they implemented that and see what kind of impact that had on the previously released fish. And so that is the big question, is when you have a closed season and you have a no targeting provision, those people going out and who have previously caught and released striped bass, what is going to happen to those previously released fish that have some level of mortality? Are all those trips going to cease? Are some of them going to occur, and which ones? Because as previously discussed, if you're going out and you're targeting another species, but you're using similar gear, that's still going to encounter striped bass. You're still going to have some level of releases. But you can't assume that every release is still going to happen, and you can't assume that every fish will be saved either. And so that's where the data limitations fall, is we just can't predict angler behavior and effort, and we don't have anything on the books already to show us that this has been implemented and this is the impact it had. As far as MRIP and the anglers, introducing some bias in the interview process, I can't say what will happen there, but I can say that we are relying on MRIP data for these analyses.
Sorry, and to add to that, I do think, though, that the no targeting provision, the major assumption behind them is that there will be a reduction in effort. That is, there will be a reduction in number of trips. Regardless of whether they claim they're targeting striped bass or not, you should see a % reduction in number of trips that correlates to what these have. So in a way, it's actually an easier way to test the accountability of these measures than to just say whether or not you saw the correct reduction in number of fish. But we should be able to go back and check and see did you see this % reduction in total number of trips, regardless of whether they caught striped bass or not, that you are predicting from this analysis.
All right, next one on the list is Dan.
Thank you, David. This is a question for Nicole and maybe Katie as well. Given that we see at the state level substantial variability in rec catches between years without rule changes, and we attribute those changes to MRIP sampling error and year class strength, my question is, how precise are the estimates of each state's projected reductions under the uniform rules? Is the variability among the impacts by state MRIP noise, sampling error, interannual variability? And would you recommend the individual states pay less attention to those projected reductions? Because I'm sensing that some states see are they above the 18% bar or below? And if they're above, well, they're going to try to torque the rules to get down to the 18%. But I'm wondering if the projected changes or projected impacts are kind of ephemeral or just illusional in terms of the real impacts, and if they're just sampling error. So could you explain how some of our states apparently aren't going to see a big change as a result of this, and others seem to be really concerned about big impacts?
Katie? Sounds like, and let me just qualify before Kate, the staff has total flexibility to flip the football in any direction at the table. They're all staff, and I would point out that Bob Beal will award all of the staff members that work for other agencies with a big Christmas bonus.
Yes, that's why we do this, the big bucks. So I think it's a good question, and I would say there's two components. For sure, there is sampling variability in MRIP, and the PSEs, the precision of these estimates vary from state to state. However, the bigger driver here is predominantly the differences in how much of your harvest you keep versus how much of it you release. So these measures, size limits, bag limits, they really only focus on how much of that harvest you're not taking anymore. And so if your fishery has a fairly large component of catch that is harvested, by doing a small bag limit or a small size limit change, you actually get a big reduction in harvest, and your overall % reduction is greater. For states that have a very high proportion of their catch that is released, tweaking the bag or the size limit analysis makes a small impact on the harvest and doesn't change the overall dead discards. So some of the states at the most northern range are 50 to 90% of their dead removals is releases. So making a small amount of change to your harvest, if your fishery is 90% dead releases, does not make a big change in your overall % reduction in total removals. Whereas a state that harvests more of the striped bass that they catch, a small bag or size limit change can have a bigger impact on your total removals.
To follow up, David, great answer. But my question is you talk about different release rates. Is that a reflection of angler ethic or access to harvestable sized fish?
It's a good question. The problem is we don't have a ton of data on the size of fish that are released alive. So it could be in some cases it is a choice of angler ethics that they would prefer to release more of these fish. However, there's also the fact that we're operating under a one bag limit. So if you go out, you have access to this fish, you catch one fish, are you done for the day? Or do you enjoy the catch and release experience? And I think that is one of the big variables that we don't have a good handle on across the states is the ethic really different? Is the approach really different? Is it access to fish? Is it the enjoyment of the trip or catch per unit effort? What is it that's driving some of these differences? And I don't think we have a good grasp on that along the coast. We can just see the final pattern.
Mike Luisi? Mike? Pass? Okay. Emerson, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question was very similar to Dr. Davis's question, so it's been answered. Thank you.
Thank you. John McMurray?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we're getting to the level of beating a dead horse with the no target closures, but I also think this question is important to answer, so I'm going to go ahead and ask it anyway. But I don't think Sherry's question was sufficiently answered. I think what she was getting at, and we all understand that there are compliance estimates, but in this case, and speaking from a practical perspective, hypothetically, one of my boats gets boarded in the Susquehanna and we're largemouth fishing, we're not striper fishing. It's essentially the same gear. So my question is, was that, so you have your straight up average compliance rate, but was that increased at all given the enforcement difficulty of this? And I also question that some of these were based on that 9% discard mortality rate, when clearly the science shows that there's a lower discard mortality in the winter months that Maryland is proposing to close, and then higher mortality in the summer months. And was that accounted for at all, or was it straight up 9%? So those are two questions.
Nicole?
So for the last part, for the release mortality, the TC in their TC criteria memo stipulated it was 9% for all proposals. And as you said, it can vary during different times of the year. It largely depends on angler behavior as well. There are a lot of variables accounting into the release mortality rate, so the TC just defined it as 9%. And then as far as the non-compliance rate, as Katie pointed out earlier, we used the average over the 2 years that we looked at as our non-compliance rate. We did not increase that by any amount to account for the comments from the Law Enforcement Committee.
Follow up, John? No? No. Oh, excuse me. I've got Roy next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been my observation over the past several weeks that there's an expectation, at least among some members of the public, that there will be, the accountability measures will include payback provisions or something analogous to that. So I wanted to get that nailed down today so there aren't any erroneous expectations as a result of the action we're taking today, specifically with regard to commercial and also recreational. Now, we all know that we have not had any accountability for recreational overages in this plan in the past. We have had accountability for commercial overages. But I wanted to see if there's any difference in expectations among members of this board in that regard. Particularly, what happens if we find out that we exceeded 18% greatly on the coast, or if we exceeded 18% greatly recreationally among any of the member states. What are the expectations? So I was wondering if, as a follow-up to Tony's comments, or perhaps Max or Nicole could enlighten us all. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Roy. That actually was a concept that I wrote down when Tony made the original point. My suggestion is we continue with the questions, but before we break for lunch, I want to have a discussion of that and make some suggestion on how to handle it. Is that all right with you? Okay, so next person I have on the list is Mike Millard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A question for Nicole or Katie, perhaps. I'd like to take one more crack at the first bullet up there on the slide about where the CEs might land with respect to the 18%. I understand that it'll be different. That means it could be higher or lower, and I understand that we can't pinpoint that. But I guess I'm curious if there's any evidence or any sense by those of you who've noodled around in the data a little more, which side of that 18 is more likely? Or is it just we have no idea which side of that 18 we would land on. Thank you.
I think unless some members around this table are in a position to shed some light on which option their state is leaning towards, maybe we could hone in on where we fall on that line. But unless that happens, again, the combinations are almost endless, so we don't know.
All right, other questions? We have any other questions? None at this point? So we have no questions, no further questions on any of the reports then. Is that correct? So let's go back to the point that Tony raised and Roy just raised, because I think there's some merit in getting a dialogue going on that before the actual break, which is the subject of accountability. And one of the things that I was going to suggest on my talking points for the meeting was that when we come back from the lunch break, if someone wants to make a motion that is a cross-cutting motion that applies to all of the proposals or all of the proposals on the coast or all of the proposals for the producer areas, then that's the appropriate time to do that. So in your case, Roy, if you want accountability to be right up front and have clear instructions on how that's going to be handled for all of the proposals that we're going to discuss, that would be the appropriate time to do that, okay? So with that as background, what I would suggest here is for different members here to talk directly to Roy's point about, and Tony's point about, should there be accountability and how should you handle that? Should there be payback provisions in the plan? We'll then all have some the benefit of some dialogue before we go to lunch. Everybody can continue the discussion over lunch, and then we'll come back and take that up again in terms of cross-cutting provisions. I've got our chair, former.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And see, Pat, he skipped you before because now that you're chairman, you get no respect. So just want to make a second. And David, I think that's a good idea, but I wanted to throw one suggestion out for maybe a lunchtime discussion too. We've got two big issues. Obviously, the accountability measures is one of them that we're going to have to talk about. But secondly, going back to the whole issue about the 49 options we have, and I'll get into that later as to how, the details of why New York had so many, but I came to this meeting today ready to narrow that down to here's what New York wants to do. And I think if maybe some discussions during lunch about if people are on the fence right now, I mean, I've gone through 2 meetings, 300 people in one, 40 in another, a survey with 1,500 responders, coordination with our neighboring states, thousands of emails, and then our council meeting, whatever. I'm done. I'm ready to say this is what New York wants to do, and I would hope that most of the states would have to do that. So if we have to have some discussion at lunchtime, that might be a real important thing to do and say, I don't have 9 options. I have 1. But I will say I need conservation equivalency to kind of tweak of the measures a little bit. And I would hope that maybe during lunchtime we can talk about that and come back and then maybe shorten that list of 49 down to a handful. So, just a suggestion.
Thank you, Jim. Jason?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So just to make sure we can make comments on accountability now. Okay, thank you. There was a lot of the accountability idea first came across my inbox. I started seeing emails with this notion, and that sort of picked up steam as we got closer to the meeting. And so I was thinking about it. I really like the concept, but this is not a trivial decision, and so I would be extremely hesitant to make it today. And the reason for that is what we're talking about in the case of striped bass is accountability to a statistical sampling program, specifically MRIP. And, you know, I think that would be an extremely difficult situation to put a state in, and that would be to hold them accountable to a point estimate from a statistical survey. So I think there are ideas of how we could build accountability. It could be some, you know, envelope of risk around what your point estimate is. You know, you shouldn't be above, you know, 20% or 30%. So I think there are ways that we can craft a really decent accountability program, but I don't think we can do that today.
Thanks, Jason. Mike Luisi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would agree with Jason in that I think we would be mistaken as a board if we were to find ourselves reviewing MRIP landings data for 2020 and comparing those data points to each state's 2017 landings to determine whether or not a state was successful in its attempt at trying to reduce overall mortality in an effort to recover the stock. We went through that already once before under Addendum 4, and I know particularly because Maryland was on the hot seat because we had a 2011 year class that was showing up in recruiting to our fishery, and it created catch estimates that were much higher than what we had in previous years. And, you know, given the uncertainty around the MRIP estimates, I just think we'd be at fault as a board if we find ourselves a year from now looking at those point estimates and pointing fingers to states to say, you were successful and you weren't, and you have to take further reductions and you don't. I look at this board we as a board, I believe, need to take every action we need to turn this stock around. And I think that if I were to evaluate whether or not we as states are successful in our attempt at addressing the problems that are in this addendum, in Addendum 6, I think we find ourselves successful if at the next assessment update, if we've reduced fishing mortality and spawning stock biomass has either slowed its decline or even turned around to some degree, I think we could look at each other and say we were successful in our attempts. I don't know that there's a state around this table that's trying to take advantage of a conservation equivalency at this time so that they can squeeze every last fish out of the ocean or out of the bay. I think we're all making sincere attempts at making those reductions, and I hope that success down the road through if we're talking accountability, that it's our successful attempt as a board, as member states, as a joint body along the East Coast, we were successful in making those attempts, and not that states are either failures or successful in the objectives of the addendum. Thank you.
I've got David and then Justin.
Thank you, me. Is that to David? Good. The follow-up on that is that when the technical committee is reviewing an addendum that we've decided, it seems like they would have more time for all considerations than a conservation equivalent. Maybe not, but you can answer that. The other part is that we're seeing the climate change effects in our fisheries in Maine because of such a rapidly warming body of water, the Gulf of Maine, as well as acidification that affects species, exoskeleton species that need to uptake calcium. So how does the technical committee add that to, say, a historical means of cutting off a fishery, reducing a fishery, the suggestions that are made, this percent, this number of fish, or the whole range that you put out, and then take in that new piece of, well, now this is also affecting it. So say the northern shrimp, we shut it off, but we're not seeing recovery in, may not for a while, because the climate change part is affecting the recovery. So is that an extra not quantifiable that you throw on as a percentage when you make a recommendation? If it's not, should it be? And would you have the same ability for a conservation equivalent with the less time that you have to look at it compared to the whole board's suggestion for an addendum? And I'll repeat anything if I got too rambling. Thanks.
Katie?
So I think, the question about climate change is certainly a relevant one. I think for a lot of these species, including striped bass, we don't fully understand the consequences of climate change. Is it changing availability? Is it changing recruitment success? Things like that. It's very hard to predict. For northern shrimp, we have a pretty good idea of what warming water temperature means for the population, and that is all bad things. For striped bass, is this increasing the availability of the same population to your waters and making it harder to predict how many fish are going to be available to your anglers? It's one possibility. I guess the question is, we have not done anything to add any additional buffer or uncertainty related specifically to climate change. We try to reduce some of that variability by focusing on the most recent set of years, or the closest, most representative set of years, in order to predict a few years into the future. In terms of our long-term plan to rebuild striped bass, that's certainly where more uncertainty is going to come in. But I do think it's up to the board to evaluate the risk level and to evaluate what probability they want these regulations to achieve in terms of, is this going to be more successful, less successful for the population, is also separate from the question of, is this going to be more successful or less successful for the fishery in achieving the reductions that we want? And does that 18% translate into the correct amount that we need for the population, versus does this bag and size limit analysis get us to 18%? Are two sort of separate questions, but I think both of them have room for the board to consider additional risk and additional buffering. And the TC can provide some guidance on some of that information, but for certain things like the effects of climate change, we don't know what the correct buffer on that would be. So I don't know if that answers your question, but certainly having more time to discuss all of this and review all of this would also be key in developing better recommendations from the TC.
David, follow up?
Yes, thank you. And that's a good answer to that part. I guess knowing that, and maybe a comment when you're giving us information that has been considered, or it's not necessary to consider it because there's not a change, or that if you have a coastwide fishery, but then Maine is part of that coastwide and we're warming more quickly, how that's taken into consideration to the degree that you feel like you should. All those would be helpful, knowing what we're voting on or discussing. And if someone comes up with a conservation equivalent that you don't feel like you've had enough time to say, look at all those factors for that specific, because theirs is going to be for a specific region, to make sure you have those, the whole picture for us to decide from. That'd be my request. Thank you.
I mean, we can certainly take that, when we develop these in the future. And I would say, the conservation equivalency is really focused on sort of short-term immediate changes. And so that's less likely to be impacted than the long-term, how is the spawning stock going to recover under these scenarios? So I think we have some more confidence in saying, 2020 is probably going to be more like these sort of reference years that we're looking at, most recent set of regulations, similar size structure to what we think is going to happen in 2020. And so, probably more similar environmental conditions. So there's more confidence there, but the longer term projections is really where the climate change uncertainty is going to come into play.
All right, just so everyone knows, we intend to break at 12:15. So right now I have 7 individuals on the list. I'll just read off the list. If you want to speak before lunchtime, please raise your hand. I'll put your name on the list. But then at 12:15, we're going to try to call it quits, get some lunch, and then come back. So I've got Justin, Richie, Chris, Pat, John McMurray, Joe, and then Brian. Anyone else who wants to speak before lunch? If not, I'll take the names in which I call them off. Justin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll start out by saying that I generally agree with what Jason said, for the board to move towards crafting accountability provisions today around the table, I mean, I think that's a sort of a big jump to take, given that they weren't in the addendum, there wasn't an opportunity for public comment, and I think we'd really have to think carefully about how to do it, given the overwhelmingly recreational nature of this fishery. I think I also agree with what Mike said, that the way we'll judge whether we were successful is coming back a couple of years from now and seeing if we achieve the necessary reductions. However, I feel that's kind of contingent on us sticking with a coastwide management program. I think if we all stay together as a coastwide management program with consistency, then we can, as a group, decide whether we met our goal down the road. I think if states want to move in the direction of adopting conservation equivalency, they're using MRIP data with all its warts to basically prove that those measures are going to achieve the necessary conservation. I think states therefore then have to be okay with using those same data to determine whether or not they met their goals. So I think the decision today about whether to move towards accountability should be downstream of the decisions about conservation equivalency, because I think whichever way we go there really, to me, will play into how important it is today to decide on accountability.
Next, I've got Richie White.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It seems pretty clear, and my guess is everybody around the table will agree, that the conservation equivalency is going off the rails. That the amount of proposals we have is really crazy. Historically, conservation equivalency was used, and this is a number of years ago, for very minor tweaks for options that were approved in the public document. So it wasn't going way outside the approval of regulations that we're seeing now. I'm getting a ton of emails from my constituents saying, how could you possibly approve a 24-inch size harvest? We had no chance to comment on that. And it's this, and it was the same thing on various other parts of this. This is all done without public input up and down the coast. States have had some public input individually on their options, but the overall public has not been able to comment on these. That's not how this commission does business. And we have to change this process. So I think that needs to be a part of the amendment to rein in conservation equivalency on striped bass. We obviously have this policy for all our species, but I think this is not working for striped bass now, and we have to put some very strict sidebars on how we use it in the future. Thank you.
Chris?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Listening to the comments today, this is, we may have jumped ahead of ourselves as far as getting these implementation plans in place in regards to accountability, because I think from the law enforcement report, it appears that that first year with major regulatory changes is a bit of a phase-in in terms of how things are enforced and making sure people understand what's going on as far as what they can and can't do. I see this accountability kind of cutting across a lot of ASMFC species. If this was a jointly managed species with one of the councils, we would have no choice but to be accountable. For instance, with bluefish, we talk about later on today. I do support talking more, either this meeting or future meetings, about looking at some sort of management uncertainty or buffer, as Katie Drew mentioned, to implement for conservation equivalence, either for striped bass or some of these other species, to account for variations in availability or year class strength or variable MRIP estimates, because I think we put forth these conservation equivalency proposals for this meeting today without talking about that in advance, and to now kind of set accountability measures based on what we have in front of us today. I don't know if we would see 49, 50 proposals if we had some kind of management uncertainty buffers and other things in place ahead of time. So, just the order of things is a little concerning, but that doesn't mean that somewhere down the line we all need to be held accountable. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Pat?
First, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank Tony for telling me I was wrong on the record as the newly appointed chairman of the commission. It's always nice to be told that you're wrong. But actually, the clarity around her point is very helpful from she didn't like that terminology, the payback component, but I understand that. I think Dr. McNamee and Dr. Davis has made some really good points, but I want to put a finer point on what Justin said. If we do have a consistent coastwide approach, we don't need to have a conversation around this. It is when you start to err out in the side of the extremes, in some cases, as Richie brought up, that I think we start to raise questions and questions are raised. So Mike said that we would be doing a disservice as a board, paraphrasing, but I think that's what he said. I think we'd be doing a disservice to the stock and the recovery and to our constituents if we don't at least consider some type of approach if we go in the direction of multiple conservation equivalencies.
Pat, I'd make the observation that your honeymoon is over. John.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the elephant in the room is that some states clearly take advantage of the conservation equivalency program, and certainly there are other states that use it appropriately. If the proposal is really equivalent to the measures in the management plan, then there shouldn't be an overage. If the measures don't work, then I think it's only right that at the very least those measures be changed as soon as possible. And I don't think that's unreasonable. I understand that the science may not be good to do that at the state level, and the surveys are, well, they're surveys. But if that's the case, then they also shouldn't be used for conservation equivalency proposals. I don't understand how it's different one way or the other.
Thanks, John. Joe Semino.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm against having the discussion now for the same reasons that Jason brought up, but since then, a lot of good discussion has happened. I think that even with the coastwide measure, if that's the way the board went, we would still need some accountability. We would need, to be talking about course corrections, and I think that's the most important thing for this stock, especially if all we're talking about is comparing it to harvest levels a few years ago. I mean, if you look at the MRIP numbers, and I'm not going to ask the chair of the TC right now, but if there was any discussion on this, but harvest levels are coming down. I mean, we're looking at probably a coastwide reduction of 50% from 2017 to the preliminary 2019 estimate, and that doesn't mean we deserve a pat on the back. There are reasons for that. We get a lot of theories on both the size of the stock, but also on movement of the stock has changed. So I think that as we move forward, and I keep pushing the hope for the start of an amendment process, we need the TC's input and the PDT's input on what appropriate measures mean for, the stock that we're working with. And I was heartened to hear Dr. Drew talk about, predictions based on the stock and, and where the stock is and what we expect recruitment to be over just using a terminal year that may not always be relevant. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Brian, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I simply, as the GA, wanted to point out that I thought the leadership of our agency, the staff within the agency have done a very good job. We adopted emergency regulations last August. That went through our fall Chesapeake Bay season. Those regulations have been in place now on our coast season. And so we've had them in place for 6 months. We've provided a pretty specific number on the predicted reduction, 23.4. So I think in our instance, the leadership has done a great job of trying to put forward a CE that everyone can take a look at and put it in place, even though there was a lot of resistance from anglers and watermen at the time. We've really heard our trophy season. Our captains are not happy with a lot of these regulations, and we hear about it quite frequently. But they've taken them on, and they've been in place now for quite a while. So I hope they do get the approval that they need. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Dennis?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've sat here all morning wondering when I should open my big mouth. As you recall, I wasn't really in favor of conservation equivalency, and I thank John McMurray for being on my side on that issue. But the board decided that conservation equivalency was the way to go. At the previous meetings, we adopted 28 to 35. New Hampshire came to the table at that time, listening to our constituents, wanting a 36-inch size limit. But the board pretty much unanimously supported 28 to 35. And it strikes me that even though everyone voted for that, they were all sitting in the background with their pencil and paper, figuring out what their conservation equivalency proposals would be at the next meeting. So here we are, talking about all kinds of measures that aren't things, as Richie said, that went out to the public. I don't think it's the right way to manage, and I don't think that the majority, and for the reasons that I don't support conservation equivalency, as we're doing it, is fair to go out to the public and tell them what you may do or may not do. It strikes me also that why did we go out to public comment and say we'll have a 36-inch minimum size or we'll have this slot when the majority of the states are not abiding by that? And no one can tell me that any of these conservation equivalency proposals is intended to do anything but advantage their states, and to take as many fish as they can by keeping within the regulations. Conservation equivalency, as it's presently being utilized, it's creating a system that's unfavored by the general public. Most of the fishermen you talk to don't like and really won't like what we come up with today with all these different proposals, and it's creating an unfair system. And I don't think in the long run that it will improve the fishery. I know it's not going to change anyone's mind, and I may be preaching a little bit, but I don't think we should be doing what we are doing now. It's not what the public wants us to do. Thanks. Oh, one further thing. As I was sitting here thinking, going back to what we approved at the last meeting. Here we are, we're all sitting around the table. We voted for 28 to 35. Picture us all, each of us with a fishing rod in a hand, and in front of us is the pond with all the fish. New Jersey's going to go off and catch 24-inch fish in one of their proposals. Other states are going to catch bigger fish. Some of us are stuck in the middle with a slot. The 24-inch fish won't become legal to us. The ones that we saved within the slot are going to move over and be caught by other people. It just isn't right. Thanks.
Thanks, Dennis. Anyone else at the table before we break? Okay, so we're going to break for at least a half hour, maybe 31 minutes. When we come back, what I would like to do is to take up the concepts that have just been discussed. So if in fact someone wants to make a motion, and I'm just citing this as an example, if someone wants to make a motion where we don't have any CE proposals, they should do that after lunch. Or if they want to make a proposal on accountability measures that they think this addendum should be governed by, do that after lunch, because shortly after we reconvene, my intent is to start dealing with the individual state proposals. We need to all have a common understanding of what the rules are. So keep that in mind. Half-hour break.
Just so everyone knows, lunch for board members and staff is out in the hallway.
You can grab it and bring it back to the table.